set out what cancel culture is about earlier this morning. Now, what do we do about it? How do we fight back? Which is what this session is about, and it's specifically asking what parliamentarians can do to conquer cancel culture. And we're very lucky to have representatives of the Commons and the Lords, and a different political spectrum, but united in a belief in freedom. Mark Francois will introduce in a minute, and Baroness Fox, Academy of Ideas, and there's a lot of publicity at the back. I have to say, Claire has been on the moral maze a number of times, and I often think this whole debate today is a bit like the moral maze. Where does the line actually lie? And there's quite a lot of moral debate about it as well. And then I'm going to introduce Mark first, if I may. Mark is chairman of the European Research Group, which actually meets today, and I'm going to shoot over and come back again to the ERG, the plenary. As you know, it played a vital role. We had Jacob briefly this morning in the Brexit debate and in challenging certain prime ministers who had different views. But Mark is an excellent MP of Rayleigh, which is in my area, Essex. He's a very good man, a very brave man, and he deserves enormous support. And I think he's in running now for the Defence Select Committee, so fingers crossed on that. But Mark, do you want to say a few words? And then...
Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Baroness, ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute pleasure to be back with the Freedom Association again this afternoon. I can see a number of friendly faces in the audience, including my great friend Lembit Opik. We were sparring partners at Bristol University. I was the chair of Bristol University Conservative Association, and Lembit was the president of the Student Union. And we used to go at it hammer and tongs in the Anson Room in Bristol month after month. So it's great to see my old friend back here. I might be, mate, but I'm still in the Commons. Anyway, oh, don't worry, that's nothing. I mean, you should have... And look, having seen your programme today, I'm honoured to be here as Nigel Farage's warm-up man. And I wanted to give you my personal experience of cancel culture. And I wrote a book. So, as you know, I and some of my colleagues in the ERG were very involved in a long, drawn-out battle in Parliament to, as we saw it, honour the result of the 2016 referendum and make sure that genuine Brexit was delivered. So, during the lockdown, I wrote a book. I have a copy here, Spartan Victory, the inside story of the battle for Brexit, still available on Amazon at a very reasonable price. And having never written a book before as effectively an ingenue in these matters, I took advice from some colleagues who had, and they said, you need to find yourself a literary agent. They'll negotiate a publishing deal for you, they'll take a cut for doing so, but they understand the publishing world back to front, that's their living. So when I wrote the manuscript, to make sure I wasn't wasting my time, I got 5 good friends to peer review it, who were, one, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who I think was entertaining you earlier, Brendan Carlin, a journalist on the Mail on Sunday, who I've known for years, Christopher Hope, better known to you as Chopper, from the Daily Telegraph, now with GB News, Paul Goodman, a former fellow MP, now the editor of Conservative Home, and Christopher Howarth, who was the ERG's researcher at the time, who I asked particularly to make sure we got the dates and times right and all the various motions and amendments in the correct order. And all 5 of them told me 2 things. One, that the manuscript was too long and it needed a bit of a haircut. But secondly, that they thought it told an important story and it was worthwhile trying to get it published. I mean, I knew I was never going to be J.K. Rowling and retire on the proceeds, but I did think, in all seriousness, it was important to get our story on the record. So with those 5 endorsements, I then wrote to a number of literary agents, and here's where it really starts to get interesting, and sent them an extract from the manuscript, because they're busy people, they're not going to read the whole thing. And one in particular, based in North London, ironically, came back and said, I really like the look of this, can you send me the whole manuscript? So I did, and he wrote back and said, I really like this, I would like to represent you. So I went to see him and we negotiated briefly, and then I signed with this guy, and he said, I'm pretty sure I can get you a publishing contract for this book. Leave it with me, I'll be back in touch when I have some news. So I went away, understandably buoyed up. And every couple of weeks I sent him an email or gave him a call. How's it going? Any luck? Oh, I'm talking to a number of people. After 3 months, he called me in for a cup of coffee, sat me down and said, I'm not going to sugar the pill. I think you've got a really good book here. I think it tells a very important story. It has humour. It's written in your voice. You were a witness to historic events in the future of the country, but none of them are going to publish it. And I said, well, forgive me, but given what you've just said, why? Why would they not want to publish it? And he said, Mark, because they all have a different view of the world from you. He said, the UK publishing industry is now incredibly woke. They nearly all voted Remain. You clearly didn't, and they're not going to publish your book. So I went away from that pretty crestfallen. Anyone who's written a book can tell you it's quite a lot of work. And I'd sort of given up, and it was a friend of mine, Lawrence Robertson's 50th birthday, and his wife's 50th birthday. It's just as we got to that bit coming out of lockdown where you could go into restaurants again. And I got there slightly late, and it was in a nice Indian restaurant in South London, and all the other tables were taken. There was only one seat left. I went and sat in the seat opposite Nadine Dorries. Before she was Culture Secretary, before the Mid-Beds by-election, but she has sold over 2 million books. She's an accomplished authoress in her own right. And because of that, I told her my tale of woe. And she said, well, I could have told you that right from the word go. They were never going to publish it. So I said, what do I do now? She said, go to Amazon. And I said, really? She said, yep, it's all been completely revamped. They will self-publish your book. And luckily, by sheer chance, an old friend of mine who I'd known who worked in defence had recently changed jobs and moved to Amazon. So we went out and we had a drink, and I asked him for some advice, and one thing led to another, and they published the book. I'm told in the world of publishing, I say I was an ingenue, the benchmark is 5,000 copies. If you can sell 5,000 copies of a book, that is regarded as a commercial success. I'm now just shy of 6,000, plus hopefully a couple more today. And the PS to the story is, one publisher who I had spoken to, directly before I got the agent, I must confess I was trying to do it to avoid the agent's fees, and he'd come close to signing, and then he wrote me an email and said, I'm sorry, at the end of the day I'm a businessman, and yours is just not a commercially viable proposition. No one's going to buy your book. So when I got the printout through that said I'd sold 5,000 copies, I sent him one of these. And I wrote, Dear X, please find enclosed a copy of the 5,001st copy of a non-commercially viable proposition. With kind regards, Mark Francois. So it can be done, and I think some people have a go at Amazon as a company. I'm not an Amazon shareholder, but they are a force for free speech because they will now often publish books that other people won't publish. And we have a problem now in our publishing industry that they are very much of one mind. Look at the trouble that Nigel Lawson had, the late Lord Lawson, when he wrote a book that was sceptical about climate change. It took him nearly 3 years and an exhaustive search to find a publisher for that book. So I think the UK publishing industry needs to look into its soul and ask itself whether it is really serving its customers or whether it's serving itself. And with that slightly provocative ending, it's wonderful to be back here, and I'll end there because I know Baroness has to get back for an important debate. Thank you for listening, and if there's time, I look forward to answering questions, including a cheeky one from Lembit. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. Can I recommend that book, actually? Because, I mean, it's quite extraordinary to follow all the actions that took place on Brexit. And, I mean, like, you know, the Malthouse Compromise, I'm sure you all know about that, but that's in the book. But all these series of sort of problem solving that didn't actually happen. But it's all in that book, and I know journalists actually use it as a sort of compendium of what actually happened when. It was very hard to actually follow, so I do commend it. Turning to Baroness Claire Fox, who's a wonderful lady. She's worked so hard in the Lords, and this is why she has to shoot off to, she's going to speak in, I think, the Israel debate. And but she does some excellent speeches, and I really do recommend, you know, you looking them up on YouTube and on Twitter, etc. It's funny because just in terms of freedom and this political spectrum, Claire was on the Revolutionary Communist Party side of things. It involved Marxism Today originally and that sort of thing. And the funny thing is, I would often think, am I becoming more Marxist or is Claire becoming more conservative? Because I keep agreeing with her. And she just talked so much common sense that I mentioned being on Radio 4, etc. earlier. But she really is worth following, and the battle of ideas is a very important concept, and you know we're all on this, and we should give her full support in that regard. So can I hand over to Baroness, who's going to speak from there, sir?
So I was told no formal speeches, it's just in conversation, so it's a slightly different way of dealing with it. I wanted to reflect on my relatively new role of being a legislator, because I was asked to think about what the law could do in relation to free speech, and there's actually been a lot of points made about this earlier. But if I can just start by saying that I have found it depressing, one of the depressing aspects of the reactions to the abhorrent anti-Semitism that we've seen on the streets in the UK, that the first thing that everybody says is, even the free speechers that I know, is what we need is more hate speech laws. What we need is more public order legislation to clamp down on these people. And can I just say that we never need more laws, and that actually even in the few years that I've been in the House of Lords, we've introduced so much draconian speech restricting and public order laws that the police have got plenty of laws that they can use. They're just not enforcing them. They're certainly not enforcing them with any degree of equality, as we've heard from other speakers before. So I want to start off by saying, by and large, I want there to be less and better laws, not more laws. And I think it's a real indictment of our society that when we're losing the battle of ideas, when we feel as though we're on the back foot, that instead of trying to win those arguments, having actually a sense of moral leadership amongst politicians, what they do is come up with yet another piece of legislation and yet another law. And I think it's a real mistake. I think it can become habit forming as well to depend on the law. So I'm sure most people in this room, if not all, considered to be an outspoken gender critical commentator. That is, I do not go along with the trans ideology that is so prevalent and so popular amongst so many of the identitarian left, rather than the sensible left like me, and particularly has taken over so many of our institutions. But I find it really depressing that the way that many of my gender-critical colleagues, who I really admire, seek to explain that their views are acceptable, is to say things like, my beliefs on biological sex are perfectly permissible because they're a protected philosophical belief under the equalities legislation. And you think, it is a disaster for me that the only way that you can assert free speech is to cite a piece of legislation, and that everybody's walking around with their protected characteristic going, no, my speech is protected over here. No, well, I've now got a piece of protected speech. The default position should be the freedom to speak whatever you want. And it's with very, very, very good reason that the law should ever intervene to stop that, as has been indicated. So my observation as a legislator is, especially now that I see it close up, is never hope that the law will solve a problem. I went along with, and to a certain extent enthusiastically, the higher education, the academic freedom, free speech bill, because I thought, well, better have a piece of legislation than not that toughens things up, and at least it's a pro-free speech law. That's good. And I, argued actually very hard for it right to the end. But anybody who thinks that will solve the cultural problem on campus is kidding themselves. So law can also make you lazy, because what you do is you get into a situation, just like in some ways we have done on so many issues, where instead of, for example, confronting the disaster of the fact that we haven't challenged radical Islamism growing in this country for fear of being shouted at as Islamophobic, or for the fact that identitarian young people are prepared to say that Jewish people deserve what they get because they're part of the oppressor, white privileged elite. Rather than having those arguments out, we take a kind of cowardly view of hiding behind the law, and it just doesn't work. And I suppose that I'll finish on this. I really enjoyed Jacob Rees-Mogg's speech, and his programme on GB News is indeed well worth watching, and I have a lot of good things to say about him, even though we come at politics from different ends of the political spectrum. But when he says that it was impossible to argue against the online safety bill because it was posited as being in protection of children's safety, it wasn't impossible if you opened your mouth and opposed it. I did, and okay, you get a lot of stick for that. Well, then when Jacob Rees-Mogg says it's a terrible law that's going to restrict adults' free speech online, yes, I know, we all know, but not very many people said so, I mean in Parliament. So the problem is that legislators can go very quiet when the law is being brought in by their own party. And we have to ask ourselves, and I suppose I have to ask Mark, what on earth are the Conservative Party even considering bringing in a conversion therapy piece of legislation apparently now it might not appear in the King's Speech. It should never have appeared ever in anything associated with any freedom, any party associated with freedom. It is an absolute disaster for free speech. So that's why I'm involved in organising the Battle of Ideas Festival this weekend, which is at the heart of Westminster, much as this conference is, and you're all welcome. But because if you want change, I can assure you that it's not happening at the heart of Westminster over in Parliament. It's happening outside in the grassroots with people like you and the people who will be at our Battle of Ideas Festival at the weekend. It's grassroots, bottom up, not legislators at the top thinking they're solving our problems by restricting our freedoms.